As I said, I just got into Muncie, and I was very much taken on the way here by different sort of country roads that I suddenly realized I was not really following the way to the university. I actually was getting lost. But there was a kind of pleasure in that, getting lost in these highways, which were very quite captivating. So unfortunately, I was hoping to arrive much sooner, but suddenly I found myself trying to get my way here. So in that sense, I'm trying right now to get my ground and begin my lecture, which this afternoon I wanted to somehow give you a sense of not only some recent works, but also a little bit of a philosophy, a background as to why these works are made, what is their intention, what's the sort of role that these architectures play in their particular context, in their particular rationales. And with that in mind, I want to begin in the images here, if I can get someone to start them for me, or oh, you know, this technology is always amazing because once you, oh, I have to point. Okay.
I don't know. Keep going, and then.
Oh, perfect. Now now it should be home free, I hope. Yeah. I was saying that it's always revealing when one arrives at a place because sometimes there are all these highways and all this signage, and you see Ball State or Indianapolis, and you follow the way without much thinking. You find yourself immediately safe in this network of circulation and this network of orientation and signage. But often when you arrive at a larger place like the city of Houston, which is the city where I have lived now for almost 26 years, you find yourself suddenly in this very puzzling enigma, this sort of notion of where am I? Am I in this incredible sort of spill of oil, as the city is often called because of its suburban development? Am I in this incredible turbid humidity that overwhelms you the moment you get out of the plane, which tends to be the most logical way of getting here because Texas, as you know, is a country, is immense in size. So most people tend to arrive in this splendid kind of view that you see from the plane, which is this ocean of greenery. But the reality of the city is not as welcoming as this natural beauty that you see in the slide on the left. What really happens is that Houston is more the production of this perpetual appetite that exists to consume the land almost without any particular sense of, I would say, self-doubt or even a sense of contrition. The land just continues endlessly, as you see here. And this kind of photograph, which I appreciate very much, for me summarizes this condition. It's a condition very present in the awareness of why we make architecture in a city like Houston, and why, particularly in my studio, we attempt to do so. I want you to remember these images because they are very critical in understanding our work. Houston, as the fourth largest city in the country, mystifies one because you ask yourself, well, how is this? How is this amazing size visible when all you see primarily is the horizon and this incredible tapestry of trees with some sporadic towerly centers that become the downtowns or the periphery edges of office buildings. But basically, the city is this amazing, immense land that has almost no end, as it is flat and it has no containment, it has no limits. So the illusion of freedom is always very much present here. Thus, this sense of expansion, this manifest destiny that overwhelms the entire city, so that it is only at night that one gets to understand the true immensity, the true definition of this very unusual, very American city of the 21st century. Houston, as a consequence of this expansiveness and this sense of limitlessness, offers also a lesson which is very important in the awareness of architecture here, which is the fact that architecture in Houston is a commodity like any in the market, that a building of 45 years ago, its destiny at the end becomes this concoction of destruction, this waste, as the building has now superseded its use and it has become a new market potential. And in its placement, most likely, a very inferior construction, a very inferior program tends to utilize that land. So I'm giving you these three images before, the image of endless dimension of space, with the image of the reality of the city as this ever-expansive domain, and this third reality, which is the reality of waste, one which one is very aware of in the city of Houston. These three conditions of the city make one ponder what is the role of architecture in a city like this, whose volatility and violence of consumption is such that one wonders what is possible for design, for architecture to accomplish. And often I find in images like this, which are about half a mile from my studio, these images are very close to me always, because these are the realities of the city, the kind of montage of this illusionistic architecture in an empty field of parking that must meet a certain demand stated by the city requirements. And then the other side where design is also present, but here design makes an investment of a much larger commitment, an investment perhaps that can reach a 500-year even plan, compared to this most likely demolition mode tendencies of the city. In fact, there is a building right here which was a theater which has been demolished, and it had only lasted 5-6 years. So what you're seeing here is this reality of the potentials and also the waste. Now it is ironic, I must say, that I began with these subtle reflections and very basic acknowledgements to start my lecture and show you some recent works by placing those reflections in the context of a place that most of you know well, as all in Indiana do, and most of the country. This is a small town of Columbus, Indiana, which, as you might be aware, to some degree, has been very critical in acknowledging that architecture has a role in the civic life of any place, and particularly in this small 36,000 inhabitant city, it is a centerpiece of activity. And I was always struck by this idea that a town, a small city, can claim itself different by this desire, by this search that design as an activity, as a human activity, makes a difference. Now in Columbus, like any other city, is full of contradictions, as architecture alone cannot make the city, cannot rescue this abandonment that I see in Houston so present. What it is ultimately is a desire to feel that architecture, and through its instruments of design, makes a difference. And I was very fortunate to come here and, oh, sorry, I turned that off. I was very fortunate to come here almost 10 years ago at the invitation of the Millers to do a small project for their private bank. And it was a very joyous occasion, as I really enjoyed coming here and discovering this gem of a small city full of wonderful architecture. An architecture that you can see from the moment that you cross a bridge or you arrive at the city hall. It's an endless repertoire of an architecture, as you see here. One of the greatest examples is this amazing church by Eliel Saarinen of 1942, which has been really the more galvanic presence in starting an interest in architecture in Columbus. Now it's purposely so placed that I have placed these images of Columbus, and I began my lecture with Columbus against Houston, so that you understand the context where I work, which is a city that values architecture primarily as this sort of commodity, as I describe it, very volatile and very subject to forces outside of its control. And in Columbus, what one finds is that architecture is absorbed in this diagram, in this didactic too of time. And I like to keep that in mind because it's always a very interesting point for me. Why? Because I think that today we live in a obviously saturated to the extreme world of media interchanges. which are nothing more than interchanges when you think about it. I mean, architecture exists ultimately in a place. It has a reason to be precisely because it is made in the local. It is global and it has universal aspirations precisely when it is able to encounter and resolve these particularities, these localities. That's what I think still makes architecture so compelling and such a unique art form. It cannot be poetry, it cannot be film, it cannot be the amazing program that inhabits your computers. It is architecture precisely because it is architecture. And architecture has, as a realm, this device of construction which transfers and communicates through time. When I came to Columbus, I was very intrigued to be in the knowledge of this wonderful little bank that Errol Saarinen, the son of Eliel, did in 1950, which today is the most contemporary bank in this small town. 52 years later, it still is the most contemporary work of architecture because it understood the message of the bank, what the bank wanted, the potential of modern architecture to reveal this program. It understood that a bank could have an enormous life of interchanges in time. And so we were asked to devise a small bank that will function as a prototype for this Irwin Union Bank. This was our first project dealing in Indiana, and actually now we're on number 4, starting number 5. So I've been very fortunate by those circumstances of life to be working suddenly in a state that has intrigued me, and so you can imagine the pleasure of being in another part of this wonderful state. But what you see here, these are studies that we did showing how we could take this prototype, which you see here. The first one we built in Seymour, Indiana, about 16 miles from Columbus. And as you can see, the idea was to create a prototype that could be placed, rotated, diagrammatized in a way that could fit in any site, but it could always be oriented to particular sets of conditions of light, traffic. But the idea was always the same, a central space that is very simple, very uniformly contained in this box with a lateral container of offices and a wing of drive-in tellers that could shift, could angle, could be flipped, could be almost as if you had this cube that you could rotate and adapt to any particular condition. This is the first one. We're actually going to start building a second one. Oh, sorry, I'm going fast here. What you see here is the context. It's not glamorous at all. It's a context like most of these leftover residual places. But nonetheless, the idea was to create a building that could have a frontality, a sense of banking where you spend more time, and banking where you must spend only 2 minutes or 3 minutes as you create this transaction of drive-in. The building is still it's a modest building, but very carefully constructed, detailed, to raise the aspirations of these rather sorry banking establishments that now you see throughout the country, where they have taken refuge in sort of historical pedigrees of all kinds. And we wanted to treat the bank as a very elemental transaction that could still create enormous pleasure in its volume, in its furniture, in its detailing, so that the arrival and the transaction itself will be augmented by inhabiting this small building. It's only a 4,200 square foot building. Eventually, this small building led to other possibilities in Columbus, and we were fortunate to be invited to a limited competition for the daycare center for Cummins Engine, which, as I failed to mention, is the patron saint of Columbus, Indiana. It is the great manufacturer of diesel engines, and they have sponsored the program primarily that has made Columbus a sort of name in the world of architecture. They are the patrons, the true patrons that sponsor competitions and architects' fees to do specific projects throughout the city. In fact, all of these buildings, most of these have been commissioned by the foundation. We were asked to, we were one of 3 competitors, and we had this site at the entrance, the gate. The bridge that you saw in the early images is here, and this is a very prominent site for a daycare center for the company. The site that we were given was this one originally, but at the end it was a problematic site because of its traffic nexus, the difficulty of traversing across the streets, and eventually we chose this one, which was an alternate site, which is closer to their, not to the downtown, but closer to where Cummins fabricates and builds all of their engines. This site was very bucolic, as you see here, but unfortunately, we selected them for the trees, but all the trees we found out later were deceased, so they had to be removed, sadly. But nonetheless, we were very taken by this site by the creek. The buildings that neighbor our project are, there's a whole array of buildings, and I encourage those of you that have not gone to Columbus to take a trip there. It's not so far for you, and you will find it very enjoyable, and if you can, get a tour of all of the engine plants. It's one of the most extraordinary things you will ever see, to imagine how these engines are put together and then to see them being put together. It's really an amazing lesson on the creative spirit and the achievements of this technical prowess. What you see here are other buildings surrounding us, one of the Kevin Roach buildings for the 600 series engines, and this wonderful building that Hardy Holzman Pfeiffer did in the 60s. These are some of our neighbors. Anywhere that you work in Columbus, you're always surrounded by this great architecture. Beginning this project, as I mentioned, after the competition was all settled, it was difficult to go back to another site. As I mentioned, we were given another site. And to start a project of such a complex program, a 24,000 square foot building for children, it was really a first for us, but one that was most difficult because I have not been an American by birth and being of another culture, I came to realize how regulated really cultures like the culture of the child is in the United States, especially in places like this, which are daycare centers. Fortunately, through the process, the building changed from a daycare center to what is called a child development center, which intrigued me the most. The idea that these places were not just harbors for children to spend 1 hour or 8 hours while their parents work, but these places could be development places for the child. And so that inspired in a way of look, a search and a proposition for making the building that could contain a sort of a multitude of possibilities for these children. And these two images, these were presented during the competition, and these were very important images. I don't know, I will not be the judge if the building can contain these images. I hope that the building does, but these were very present in my thinking. And one of them is this wonderful image of a child in the orphanage by Aldo van Eyck in Amsterdam. And this other image, which one can call it an image, is by one of my favorite poets. And both images are wrapped in a certain degree of mystery. They don't tell you exactly what the child is expected to do or what it must do. I was most intrigued by the journey between the child's understanding of her reflection, this wonderful space between her gaze of wonder and this kind of nebulous shadow, and also what Garcia Lorca leaves out here as he lets us to believe that we ourselves somehow have to find this. And so in a way, the building for me was this potential that in building this small community for children, these youngsters, these kids from actually 6 months to preschoolers could find this. And what you see in the final design is a building that in the sketches began in a similar manner to group these three infant worlds as infants, preschoolers, toddlers, all of them around this central space that will allow for us to eliminate a double corridor and create this sort of inner public life while creating very specific groupings that are part of the program. And in a way, it was a desire to subvert some of these regulations, which are so claustrophobic, as some of these children cannot move from one room to the other without extreme supervision, or they cannot touch one group from the other. I mean, it's almost absurd sometimes. So we wanted to quietly subvert those particular laws by creating a highly public space that initially and regardless will initiate this publicness, this contact. So what you see in the plan eventually is not only are the groups categorized almost in a clockwise manner, but also this street which spills out into different spaces, allows this publicness to occur. And also in the gardens themselves, the playgrounds are also interwoven as well. So we wanted to create this sort of almost direct or indirect routes by which the children could break away every once in a while from this rigorous control system that is often necessary for reasons of liability and reasons of management. But nonetheless, we wanted to really propose that, and they accepted that. The building, this is the main elevation, it's highly urban in the sense that it faces part of the city, part of the streets, while in the interior, the scale changes dramatically, and the scale becomes more the scale of the child, the scale of the city in the main elevations. This is also evident in this section, how you see the elevation you saw earlier was here, while the interior court where the garden is, the scale is completely different, and light wells begin to occur at every level of the building. The purpose in this whole project was really, it was a reflection as well of how little children need to survive in a space. And you know, the conception of the building was such that we felt that if you could take all of the toys away and you could take all of their distractions, that the children would still find in the building sufficient information to develop their imagination, their curiosity, to move forward in life without all of these appendages and gadgets that most of them sadly are given as if they needed them for their imagination. So we wanted to create a building that could certainly be the repository of these obligatory things, but at the same time a building that you could easily say, let's remove everything, and can the building still be capable of awakening the child's imagination? So there are many things that happen even in the exterior elevations, when they go to the restroom, when they're playing in their rooms, the windows change, shift, they look across each other. The whole idea was that the building could be this endless potential of shift and change. In the playgrounds, you can see how the windows are very different, and children began to, I noticed when I visit the place, they even began to measure their heights or imagine they can be higher, that they can skip, that they can move. All of these things are very important, and they're deployed in the building. This is one of my favorite photographs where they're walking along the street, carpets are different colors, they can play, the reflections of the windows. They begin to have this sort of almost subversive agenda that goes outside of their very prescribed rooms. So this was very purposeful. And I think it can best be captured in this image where you see the scale of the city, the drop-offs, the light wells, and the gradual dissemination of those window scales into a more scaled-down world of the child where they can roam freely into this place. But for instance, you probably noticed that there are lots of trees in our original drawings, but you notice in the main courtyard there's not a single tree, as we were not allowed to put a tree because they were afraid that children would climb the trees and fall. And I kept saying, well, actually, that's how I learned to be careful, as I fell off many trees when I was a child. And I said, there's nothing wrong with that. But even though we put this wonderful cushion here that you see so they could bounce, I was not that fortunate when I was a child. But this kind of project also led for another commission for Cummins, which was interesting and ironic, as we were asked to design a prototype for repairing their engines throughout the country. Sadly, the project didn't move beyond 2 prototypes, as we discovered that it was an impossible task, as these prototypes, which were designed in the 50s by individuals like Elliot Noyes and Harry Weiss, had become obsolete, but they also had become obsolete because trucks and engines have become extremely complex and not as predictable as they were in 1950, when these units were very carefully and almost modularized. In fact, today we found that the biggest problem is that every distributorship around the country has different demands. If you're in Florida, there's more RV trucks. If you're in Seattle, there's more logging trucks. If you're in whatever you are. So it's an impossible idea, but nonetheless, we thought of taking the challenge. And of all ironies, the first one and the only one that was built was in Houston, Texas, which is, again, a most ironic twist. And we were given a site. This is the unit, the prototype in Houston, the existing prototype. And the project was really to design 3 prototypes, one 20,000 square feet, 40 and 60,000 square feet. The one in Houston is 60,000. And this is sort of the kind of level of design that most of these facilities have. I mean, Cummins has made an effort, at least, of hiring different people throughout its history to design them. But in this case, like Peterbilt, as you can see, it's pretty much a front with this wonderful kind of exaggerated truck lifted. But in the back, it's just a shed of very dismal light conditions and very dismal working conditions where they repair these trucks and completely sealed off as if it was some kind of incarceration camp. So these are not great prototypes in terms of places to go. And we took that as a kind of idea that although the budgets on these projects are really minimal, we wanted to capitalize on that, not as a restriction, but more as a liberation, in the sense that we were given just the basics. And the first one, the one that was built, is here along 610 Interstate, a very private bayou. So we oriented the building towards this area that has no building ever planned around it. And then we placed the building in this T fashion to create the maximum exposure along the freeway, as this building functions not only as a repair workshop, but it also must function as a place that advertises clearly what's going on. People can come in, have repairs in 1 hour. They can go in and get parts. There are offices. But the whole building becomes a giant billboard whose eventuality in terms of the length of the room is almost 400 feet, as beyond this frontal facade, there is this incredible long nave of endless row after row of repair shops. So the idea was to create this sort of immediate context of recognition where you could see right away the frontality of the building and you will park on the back. This is the context of the building. Oh, sorry. This is, again, the very modest building of very minimal budget, but we were trying to expand that constraint and offer even the light fixtures that were selected or the type of balustrades. Everything had a sort of customization, even though it was from the most standard of pieces, as it becomes evident at every level of the building. Landscape was very important as well. This is past the main front. This is where they go in on a 1 hour repair shop. But as they're here, these are the windows that the truckers will look out, so they see out into this garden, so that it's not this dismal kind of places that so often are given to them. The waiting areas are more luminous. They have a certain degree of craft and within these very standard pieces. This section really explains very well where you are is at this point here, getting parts, getting invoices, and then when you're here, you rest your arms on this granite top and see gradually in section how the building opens up to this wonderful open loft-like space where the trucks are repaired. Everything is a standard, but we use them in a way, try to invent within these standard pieces from the flooring, the type of coloring that we use on all the electrical and mechanical equipment, trying to capitalize once again on this highly limited domain. As you see here, these are the conditions that they were in, where the trucks had practically no space to work with. The doors are very, very narrow, and some of them don't have lights. We open more light and ventilation systems and so on and so forth. So it was a lot of enjoyment in the process to take this rather menial domain of budget and expand it, maximize it through the findings of architecture, even though when you're dealing with very standard pieces. And this is often very present in our work. We are aware that architecture is today a commodity. We're not saying it's not, but we're aware that its greatest commodity is really this potential of maximizing space and light, and the idea of architecture is the glue that makes those concepts become even more apparent. This is something that I want to show. I'm just showing you recent works This tiny house, it's an example of what I'm saying now at the scale of the dwelling. This is a very dilapidated area in the city of Houston. It's called the Houston Heights. I chose purposely this photograph that is rather gray and murky to show you how kind of depressed the area is. There was a railroad track. Houston has no zoning, so things happen. There's a store, there's something else. You don't know what's going to happen. And we were asked to design this very tiny house for a very limited budget. And it is always very inspiring to take the challenge because you really have to deal with architecture in its coarse, almost raw elementality. And I say that in the positive sense. Often I think that many architects have too much budget often, and that doesn't help them or necessarily can help, and I don't think it's either way. All I'm saying is that it's a very good exercise for all of you when you get out, if you decide to have your own practice, to dwell on that, because it's an important lesson, and it's a lesson in a situation where we're building, and buildings are costing more. Houses around this neighborhood cost around $350,000, and for tiny houses built practically of cardboard, these foundations are built very badly. The wood, the siding, the materials that are used are extremely sadly defined, and people have no notion. They just buy this product. They don't think, they just select it, they buy it, and the market is the bank giving the mortgage, of course authorized because he has a certain insignia. And in this case, we wanted to say, well, what if we can take that budget, and actually we built this for $220,000 for this couple, which was much, much less than the houses around of very inferior construction. And we wanted to do it based on the idea of construction, but construction not only in terms of materiality, but the idea and constructing the site. So the site was rather very narrow, 39 feet by 120, and the house had this wonderful pecan tree, which is one of the commodities of Houston. And we orchestrated the house as one single loft facing this big tree in this garden, and also try to create as maximum distance from the property line. So we built this large concrete block wall to give more endurance and durability again to the house, and create this a small sort of tiny, it's about 2,200 square feet, 2,400 square feet, and a garage. This house in Houston is very typical of what I often believe is that Houston, as a very artificial city, begins with a fiction. There is a fiction at play in everything that you make in the city. It's a city that grew out of the developer's dream. It is still a developer's dream city. That's why things like Enron are not so unusual in our city, because they are this magnification of dreams that often get out of hand, as in the case of Enron. But Houston, throughout its history, is really the projection of these fictions that become dreams, and in turn they become realities. So I showed these two images with those thoughts, because for me what was more important was not this image when the building is complete, but it's really this image when suddenly the architecture allows this interchange and allows this beginning of its true life to take over the entire site, and eventually instill in its dwellers this endless episode after episode, which ultimately is what architecture is unique in its position. So every level, although with this very limited domain of money, we were able to finish the concrete floor almost as if it was the most handsome of marbles, and use the money we saved to use this solid granite top and the best fixtures that we could get, so that we established these interchanges again, by which an architecture is able to transmit that it's not just an object to be consumed, but actually it's an object to be enjoyed in the pleasure of time, in the pleasure of decades, as one hopes it is. And so the pleasure of the work is precisely in those things that you cannot really buy immediately. They don't have a price, as most of them come in the nature of natural light and its eventual endless pleasure. I think in moving from Houston now, I will continue on a few more works, and I won't tire you this afternoon. But these projects are mostly to give you a sense of how those initial images that I show you intersect each of these works. And I will clarify that at the end as my own enigma of this lecture will be revealed. But I am trying to give you a sense of how the most powerful thing that architecture can do today is not this sort of simulation world that we have been so given a free rein to believe it's where it is at. In fact, the pleasure and the wonder of architecture still continues to be solving problems at a very localized level. And I know that that always sounds like a contradiction in our world of almost irreversible globality, when in fact the idea of globality has always been in our parameters of thinking. It's just that today we have more distractions that makes us believe that this globality is something new, when in fact it's as ancient as the idea of love might be. But I think that what we have today is an opportunity to actually, through our global networking or our global awareness, to resolve problems where they matter, which is ultimately at that local condition. There's nothing sadder than a work of architecture that dreams globally when in fact its roots are in the local terrain. And in that global dreaming, it almost evaporates its potential for that universality. So in fact, it is only when the work achieves this sense of looking closely at a place that it achieves this, in my view, this richer domain of life and time. And I say that as an introduction because we had to work on a wonderful project in Austin, Texas, about 2.5 hours from Houston. And what we had to do was to create a third element for this house and a guest house. This couple, very elderly couple, owns this wonderful library and objects of art, and they wanted a building where they could house these objects and these books separate from their own house, but they wanted also a building that could somehow clarify all the kind of fractured pieces that this previous architecture created. And there was actually a path that led to a garage here, and we eliminated that and created a turnaround. And the small building here that you see here, it's actually, as you see in the sketches, it's more like a bridge linking the main house and the guest house, which is at a lower plateau from this plateau. And so the impression was that the building could be a bridge, it could be a space that could link, it could also be a space to meander, to ponder, to stop, to pause. And eventually the building becomes a literal bridge as you go from the main house into the large library volume. There are rooms beneath. The garage carport has been placed here, so we were able to eliminate going all the way to the back of the property. So the whole building became not only a gateway, but a very functional small piece of architecture that establishes this relationship to the main house, which is here at a higher plateau, and the guest house that will be here. You can see how that bridge quality of the building is present. And we wanted the building to have a sort of extraction of the materials that were in the main house. Austin is notorious for its usage of limestone. I mean, if you think that here in Indiana they require you almost in every project to use limestone, imagine in Austin where it's actually you're sitting on a bedrock of limestone. So Austin limestone is a must in most projects, but I noticed that it's throughout the city it's used in a very almost a sloppy way. They use it plaster in very unusual manner and not very well done in terms of craftsmanship. So we wanted to push the craftsman to look very carefully at how limestone could be used more on a stacked manner, like masonry, which was a little bit of a luxury in the building, but it worked very well here as a plinth, as a sort of bridge point for the larger volume that spans the whole library center. As you move closer, you see how the bonding of the limestone is put together with EP wood and galvanized steel bridges, and also these columns of cypress that have been stained a natural color as the siding here. You see the library lighted, how it works as a link to the main house here and a link to the guest house. So the building in this small building clarifies and makes clear the relationships between these various pieces, and it also becomes an active participant in the life of this complex. It's a small complex of house, gardens, and so on and so forth. But the pleasure of the building relies in moving through from one building to another. So it's a highly urban proposition, as this is, you'll be at the main house, and we added these fountains and these benches. This is this window here, but you move across the bridge, the ramp, and go into the library. The library is almost like a second house in a way, because it has many purposes. It's a place to entertain, to read. This gives you a sense of the materials employed. This beautiful EP wood, which is very durable for the deck, which it's wonderful, this red color. Here you understand a little bit the concept, which is the plinths of limestone have these various rooms, but the carport is here, which becomes a big room. But the main idea is the library room, which is one single volume, very high, very carefully illuminated, that wraps the entire volume, almost 55 feet by 26 feet, all the wall of books, as I like to call it. As the entire, there's a relentless wrapping of these books that go around the entire room, and with fenestrations here and there to alleviate the density of the mass. One of the things that we've been doing lately, and with better result, is competitions, which invited competitions, and some you win, some you lose. This one we did not win, but it was a very exciting competition in Dallas, in the city of Dallas. Because of this competition, we got another competition which we won in California, so we're very excited about that. So one competition sometimes leads to another work, but this one I wanted to show it in the context of the final project that I'm going to share with you this afternoon, which is also in Indiana for DePaul University. But this is a school of performance and visual arts in the Arts District in the downtown center of Dallas, Texas. And what you see here actually is the series of buildings that populate this district, which is called the Arts District. It's the largest arts district in the country, meaning in terms of being one unit. I mean, obviously, cities like New York or Los Angeles have a larger group of buildings, but in terms of one unit, this whole block here is the most, the largest and the most efficiently designed in terms of flows. Here is the Dallas Museum of Art, and Renzo Piano is doing a sculpture garden here. There's the Meyerson Opera House and so on, gardens. There's a new building that's going to go here. We were given the site, which was this one here, is around here. And part of the project was very interesting because we had to preserve an element of an existing building. The building that existed here, the 1922 building, had to be preserved. Everything else was there. This is a school for the visual and performing arts, so they were already functioning in this rather derelict series of additions. They were all in very bad shape. And what we began to propose was to create a series of archaeological excavations and removals, and preserving not only the obligatory, the one that we needed to keep, but also preserving this unit, and start to create a series of entablatures and connections that led to a whole new project in the process. The 1922 building had to be preserved. It had to be restored. We could not touch it. But what we did is we made it, as you see here, into the critical piece that created the rest of the ensemble of architectural pieces. Here is the Arts District in its totality, the museum, the piano building, other buildings to come. These are all museums. This is going to be now a new auditorium for opera and music. And here you see the connections that we were trying to establish, and the building here. Very large building of almost 260,000 square feet in size. Eventually what you see here is the 1922 building preserved pretty much as it was, except we restored it and started to create new entrances, new devices. And this massive building was kept as a single ongoing roof that has a ground level and a first and second level, but creating this community of courtyards and spaces that are very random. As you see here, this is a view from this corner, so you can see how vital and how energized that interior will be, even though it's a highly condensed environment. That idea, of course, was this notion that the building itself, the small original 1922 building, could become the generator of this larger canopy of roofs that creates this wonderful series of almost interactions with the students, because the main idea was to get the students to spill out of these rooms and have this kind of ongoing activities. We were also very, here you see the model, the competition model, which shows that very large roof that wraps the entire addition, the two existing buildings that were kept, and how the entrances and ventilation, balconies, all of these things were integrated, always with the idea that the city is the most important object in the making. The building is just this participant in the city, but most important always the notion of how can this building fulfill or contribute to this larger scheme of things. This is always, for me, the most vital reward and purpose in any architecture when you work in the city. I'm going to end with this project, which is actually almost about to be finished. In fact, I was there this morning, and they're supposed to finish in 2 weeks. And we're going to have an exhibition on this building. So if you happen to be at DePaul University, I will invite you to go on after October 10. It will be hopefully an exhibition that you might like. But it's mostly about a project that deals with an important acknowledgement that I must make, which is that today universities throughout the country are very much aware of their particular histories, their pedigrees. And each university across the United States has this desire to recapture some of this pedigree. Now, that's always been a dilemma for me, because I feel that universities are laboratories for ideas and growth of ideas, and buildings in a way reflect this growth of ideas. I am a full-time observer as a teacher as well at Rice University, and I have seen that this can be very claustrophobic when history becomes so ruled and so condensed in only one perception, that the richness of the university as a built environment can be lost. And I offer those initial reflections because when I came to DePaul in 1997, this was when the commission was given, there was a lot of conflict. This is an art center, what I'm going to show you, and the conflict was basically the artist, the client, and the university, the trustees, who saw that the role of a building was more to proclaim this image that was very imperious in a way, regardless of whatever the program was at play. And curiously enough, DePaul had this wonderful library that you see here, which has now been transformed because it was not Georgian, within the Georgian landscape. But this library was quite beautiful to me. I thought it looked like those wonderful buildings of Asplund in Sweden or other Scandinavian architects. But the building that I really like is this one, East College, because it seemed to me to be the most authentic in the group. It seemed to have more of a, I would say, the kind of historical pedigree intact, but it was also a building beautifully crafted and very much the inspiration for subsequent buildings. It was a difficult, often a little bit contentious confrontation sometimes with the trustees, but eventually things happened that a donor was found, and we were able to build the building that was meant to in the client's view and in our view to be there. And we got the commission after, I didn't show these two projects. These are earlier works from mid-90s, the Museum of Fine Arts addition in Houston, which was a building finished in 1993. And this one in Williams College in 1996. I'm only going to show these two images because these two buildings were very influential in us getting the project, as the committee visited them and they liked they like their spaces and their architecture. So when we came to the PO, we were assumed that everything was clear, but it wasn't so clear. And so it has been a long project. Actually, it's almost 5.5 years when it's all complete and done. So you can see how long it has taken. But these two buildings share a similar time, but a similar program. They're both art. This is an art studio center for Williams College, and this is both a studio for children and the administrations for the Museum of Fine Arts. But these two buildings were very much present when we approached the project, not only as sort of the reason we got the job, but more importantly as we wanted to continue the ideas of these two buildings in this new art center. Again, new views of the PO. This is where the art center is now. This building is next door to our site, which is one of the reasons that trustees have this aversion to anything that is modern in the campus or has some degree of modern tendencies. And by modern, I mean not so much a style as much as I use the word modern more generous than just a style. I would like to say that modern is just a way of being in the world at that particular time, being able to solve a problem both with the benefits of history and the progress that one is made in that history. And one of the problems is that this building is very brutal in its architecture, and it has really frightened many of the trustees, and with good reason, as the building was product of the 60s, when you remember those buildings all across campuses were very out of scale, and they had no sense of merging the scale of their volume with the scale of the dweller. And with obvious reason, this is a concern, and I think that's one of the reasons that many of these campuses throughout the United States share this ambivalence. I was very much taken by some of the architectures of the PO, and I was more attracted to the materiality of the campus. And I say that because it was a key element in the design. I felt very strongly that in our design, it was important to look at not only the context, but also why is this so critical for the PO? Why is this concern of a stylistic continuity so critical? And we wanted to say you could still have a building that can become part of the campus, but a building that could look at the campus as a palette of materials, of sensibilities, of textures, of scales, and arrive at a solution that ultimately reflects the synchronicity and the symbioticness with a program such as an art center. And the site that we were given originally was this corner site at the west part of the campus, and this is the previous building I show you. And eventually, in time, that humble site grew up to be this whole site as the program went from 40,000 square feet to 90,000 square feet. So we were able to expand and use not only the given program, but also the site itself. And the project has just taken much longer than anticipated, primarily also because of that. The Po University, as I mentioned, is full of these wonderful buildings of all. It's very mixed, and it's curious that now they're opting only for one particular stylistic preference, but actually the campus is full of very different potentials. And we wanted to show that our building could actually use some of these references and expand them and show another dimension to these works. The corner of Indiana and Hannah Street became the focal point. This is one of the early maquettes, one of the early models that shows the building at its initiation. And gradually the building got larger and bigger. This is a building that CSO, the office that we have been working associated with in this project, is also completing right now. And this is an important relationship because in the process, they have transformed this building into this building. And in the process, each of the two buildings began to inform one another as to what could be added, what could be shared in this campus exploration. The eventual program as constructed, as you can see, fits very tightly in a very limited site. All of these lines are dictates of the property, the setbacks. The building fits very tightly, very carefully, almost constricted by this property. And the main device in the initial design was how to stretch the north elevation to a maximum opportunity, as all of the studios must face, meaning painting and drawing, must face north. And that is why the building at this north facade is stretched to the maximum, even acknowledging this angle of the street. And then the other studios are stretched along Jackson Street. The building is very complex. It has ceramics, sculpture studios, student galleries. It has this small museum quality gallery that becomes the centerpiece of the public avenues of the art center, and then a small auditorium and so on and so forth. Upstairs we have a painting, drawing, other galleries, seminar rooms, offices, and so on and so forth. It's a very compact, very condensed building, but very much, again, with the idea that by stretching the north elevation to its maximum width and potential, we will be able to place the large painting studios and drawing studios as a prominent feature of the design, but also as integrated as possible within this colonnade that leads to the west part of the campus and the large entry vestibule as you approach the building. So that in fact, the building is the result of this very difficult negotiations of site and program to create at the end not only a unit, but also a building that could be traversed not only along the north facade, but also along the south facade, and it becomes a series of volumes that jump up, that become wider, expansive, that condense, compress, and at the end you end up in the gallery, which is this very special room that has higher ceilings, flexible spaces to the display of art. And there's also the student gallery on the other end here, and the large studios above it. So as you can see, there are many multiple programs circumnavigating and existing together in this building. It also is present in these images the desire that I stipulated earlier of how to fit a building within a campus whose pedigree is very much a consciousness in everybody's mind. And we wanted to show how we can take the similar brick or limestone and take it to another level of abstraction, and yet at the same time making a building that will seem to have been there, like it belonged there and it can be there for many years to come. But the scales and the detailing is very different. And as you can see here, even the brick has been very carefully flushed out, and the mortar is the same color as the brick, so that the relationship of the building is more planar instead of the more decorative aspects that can be found in other brick applications. The crispness of the lines are there, and also the detailing, so that to create this both solid building but very delicate in its detailing. And in the limestone, for instance, how these patterns have been created to create not only syncopations but also scale changes at every level of the building, and to appease and assuage the large scale, as this building is quite large. The studios are very tall, and so on and so forth, so you can imagine. There is the detailing throughout the building. It's not a building of great expense. It's still a very modest building. I'm amazed by this, because we are doing some studies for Rice University for an art center, and I was just amazed by how expensive Houston has become in the last 10 years, since that was the last time we did a larger building in the city. And the value that we gotten out on this building is really amazing. And so the university, I think, has, although it's a modest building, we've been able to, again, expand the domain of that cost to turn it into a more interesting building in terms of how it's constructed. This is a typical studio, those large light wells, which go almost to 22 feet. This is very much a view out of one of the studios, a more intimate corner of one of the studios. And again, different. They're all very similar. They have different sizes. Some are double, some are single. You see a single one here. And this is, again, the building. These photos were about 3 weeks ago. The building is not complete yet. This is going to be the two-story gallery that you saw at the end of the promenade in the interior, which shows how the light comes in directly, bouncing off, never to have direct light into the main volume. And that's just a detail of the condition of the materials of the courtyard.